Today I'm going to talk about my 2008 Honda Ridgeline RTL that I bought in 2017 with 142,000 miles. So I've had it for 7 years and 45,000 miles, and I'm going to give you my thoughts on it after that time. So back in 2017, I was driving a 1995 BMW 325 IS Coupe with a 5-speed manual transmission, and it was at about 190,000 miles. And although it was generally reliable, it certainly was getting a little bit aged. But reliability aside, it was just starting to get a little impractical for my needs. There wasn't a lot of space, no back door. It was my only vehicle, and I just wanted something with a little bit more practicality, something with an automatic transmission. I also knew that I wanted to get a truck. And at the time, with the age and mileage of the trucks that I was looking at, I really wanted to go Japanese just for the reliability. And unfortunately, the Toyota Tacomas were just out of my price range. And the Frontiers of that era had some reliability issues where the transmission fluid and the coolant would mix in the radiator due to leaks and cause major issues. So that left the Ridgeline. The only modifications I've made is that shortly after I purchased it, I put on some slightly oversized Cooper Discover AT3s. They're about a 30.5-inch diameter over the stock 29.5-inch diameter. And then about a year and a half ago, I actually installed a Traxta 2-inch lift. It's just a spacer lift, so it still uses the stock suspension. And then I switched over to the BF Goodrich All-Terrain TA KO2s in that same size as the Coopers. So first off, I want to talk about some of the uniqueness of the Ridgeline. Unlike the vast majority of trucks, especially back in March of 2005 when the Ridgeline was released, the Ridgeline is unibody versus body-on-frame construction. And the Ridgeline gets disparaged a lot for not being a real truck because of this. And in some sense, it is true, it's not a real body-on-frame truck. Although it is a unibody, the unibody does have fully boxed integrated frame rails. A lot of people also say that it's just a Pilot or an Odyssey with a bed, but it actually doesn't share its sheet metal with any other Honda product, and 95% of the interior was unique as well. The Ridgeline really was ahead of its time. For March 2005, for a truck to come out with fully independent suspension, a unibody, an in-bed trunk, and a dual-action tailgate is pretty crazy. While a unibody does make some concessions as far as truck duty is concerned, there are clearly some benefits as far as packaging and ride and handling. So for example, the Ridgeline is a mid-sized truck, and it has 112 cubic feet of passenger volume, as well as a flat load floor throughout the entire cabin. Compare that to the 2005 Toyota Tacoma, which had 99 about cubic feet of interior volume, and the F-150 in 2005, which was a full-size truck, had 122 cubic feet of interior volume. So it falls right in between the Tacoma and the F-150 for interior volume, although it actually falls slightly closer to the full-size F-150. And it gets even more interesting when you look at payload, and for this one, I'm gonna go ahead and use my cheat sheet here. So the Toyota Tacoma of the time had a 1370 payload. The Ridgeline has a 1554 payload, and the F-150 a 1780, and that's with similarly configured 4-door short bed for the Tacoma and the F-150. So by that measure, it also falls between the Tacoma and the F-150, although in that case it's slightly closer to the Tacoma. But still, for a truck that gets a lot of crap for not being a real truck, I think it's actually funny that it was quite a bit better than the comparable Toyota Tacoma of the time. Where the unibody construction does start to show its fault is in towing, where the Ridgeline's towing capacity was 5,000 pounds, the Tacoma's was 6,500, and the F-150's was 8,500. But the real selling point of the unibody construction comes with the ride and handling. So for this one, I'm going to go back into the archives and quote the Car and Driver mid-size truck comparison from June of 2005, where Car and Driver said, "The ride is on the firm side, but the payoff is clear communication line between the road and driver. We're not talking sports car feel here, but it's head and shoulders above its competitors. The Honda topped the chart in every subjective handling category. And in addition to that, it had the best road holding score on the skid pad in their test." So clearly there's some pretty significant ride and handling benefits to the unibody construction, although you do have some sacrifices, especially in towing. While we're talking about truck features, one of the other main things we need to talk about is the all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive systems. So most trucks of that era utilized a traditional transfer case with a high and low range four-wheel drive that you could manually switch between. The Ridgeline uses Honda's VTM4 all-wheel drive system, which was co-developed with Borg-Warner and is a more standard all-wheel drive system that you would find in a car or SUV, although it does have the VTM4 lock feature, which allows you to send the maximum 70% of the torque to the rear wheels while you're traveling under 18 miles an hour, and also basically functions as a locking diff between the back two wheels, although probably not as robust as an actual locking differential. It functionally splits torque equally 50-50 between the two rear wheels. So while it's not a traditional four-wheel drive system, it is more than you get in just a standard all-wheel drive system. And if you're interested in reading about any of the other specific details about the first generation Ridgeline, it has a very comprehensive Wikipedia page that David Tracy actually wrote an article about. So now I'm going to move on from talking about the Ridgeline in general to talking a little bit more about my specific experience with it, what I've liked about it, what I haven't. So first off, what I've liked about it is going to be the biggest advantage of what it is, as I mentioned before, which is the ride and handling and interior space you get with the unibody. When you really think about it, when you're looking at a vehicle like a truck that is inherently compromised because it has to be extremely capable, be able to haul and tow things, but at the same time, most of the time you're driving around, you're not going to be hauling or towing. You want it to be comfortable and handle well. If you think about it from that perspective as a trade-off, ideally what you'd want is something that has just the right amount of capability that you need as far as truck stuff, so that when you're driving around 99% of the time and not towing or hauling, it's going to handle and ride as comfortably as possible. And for me, that's really what the Ridgeline is. And I've actually done quite a bit. I remodeled our entire house using this truck, and there were definitely times that I could have made fewer trips to the dump because the bed is a little bit smaller, but at the end of the day, it got everything I needed to get done. I made a lot of dump runs. I hauled a lot of new building materials, and this was always able to get the job done. For me, one of the other big benefits to the all-wheel drive versus a standard four-wheel drive truck is here in the Pacific Northwest, in the winters, we get a lot of mixed weather because we don't get super cold. We tend to sort of ride the line between freezing and not freezing. So when we do get snow, a lot of the time it's sort of this in-between state where some of the roads are clear, some of the roads still have slush on them, or if you go up in the hills and the elevation, then there might be a lot of snow. And it's nice to just have all-wheel drive where you don't have to worry about switching in and out or between 2 high and 4 highs. You go from dry pavement to wet pavement to slushy to snow or whatever the case may be. On top of that, with a truck with a traditional four-wheel drive system, when you're in two-wheel drive, it's going to be rear drive, and that's going to be under the bed with no weight. So then you also have to consider that when you're in two-wheel drive, you actually have less traction than almost any other car on the road because you've got no weight over those rear tires. Unless you're throwing sandbags in the back, then that's a whole thing. So really, for the type of mixed snow conditions that we get here in the Northwest, having that front-wheel drive biased all-wheel drive system is actually really awesome. Some of the smaller things that I've appreciated about the Ridgeline are, like previously mentioned, it does have a spacious and comfortable interior. The rear seats fold up all the way and it has that nice flat load floor in the back. The bed with the trunk in it has been awesome. I love the ability to just store a bunch of stuff in that trunk all the time. It's watertight, it's lockable, and so I can keep all my tools and different things I like to have with me all the time in that bed, and I don't have to have them visible in the back of the truck or taking up space in the back seat if I need to have passengers. I've also found that the composite bed is plenty durable for my use. Like I'd mentioned before, I've hauled tile, I've hauled brick in the back, and I've never had any significant damage other than some scrapes. Probably the most extreme example was I actually loaded a 4-foot box scraper into the back with a tractor, and I'm not the most experienced tractor operator, so it was definitely banging on the sides and scraping on the bottom. And while it did scrape the surface, it didn't lead to any significant or notable damage to the bed. And the final benefit is the reliability has been good. It hasn't been perfect. It's at 187,000 miles now. It's 16 years old, so it's understandable that a few things have gone wrong, but in the time that I've owned it, outside of regular maintenance, I've had to replace one power steering O-ring that started to make some noises. Basically, it wasn't causing any serious problems, but it was starting to whine. So I replaced that, that fixed it. And then outside of that, I have had some issues with some water leaking in because this does get stored outside. That's something that is not uncommon with the first gen Ridgeline, so I did actually have to remove the roof rack and add some sealant in that roof rail there, which is a common leak point for these. And then the final thing is I do have a axle seal that's leaking on the front driver's side. So that's been a slow leak that I think has basically been happening since I bought it, but recently it started to pick up a little bit, so I think we're gonna have to address that. All right, so now to talk about some of the things that I haven't liked as much with my ownership. I think the biggest downside to the Ridgeline and my most legitimate criticism would be the fact that it doesn't have a low range. While the VTM4 has the VTM4 lock system, I think that's really cool, but I just think that having that low range transfer case would have made a big difference in the off-road capability and also just the overall utility of the vehicle. So I think it's kind of a bummer they didn't include that. Next up is the appearance. So I actually like the styling of the first generation Ridgeline, but I do think that it would have looked a lot better if from the factory they would have included something a little bit closer to the ride height that I have now with this 2-inch lift and the inch bigger diameter tires. I think that now it honestly looks just like a stock truck should. It has the right stance and proportion, whereas from the factory it looks a little bit bloated and low to the ground, which doesn't really help the overall appearance. But I think that especially now with the lift and tires I've got on it, I like it. And that's not really uncommon. There are definitely trucks out there that look good from the factory, but there are other trucks where you have to put a little lift and bigger tires on them to make them look proportionate. So not a big deal, but it's just something that could have been improved. There are also some downsides to the in-bed trunk, one of which is the little bit of space between the trunk and the rest of the bed will get packed full of debris if you're moving bark or dirt or drywall or other things that have sort of a fine grain to them. It'll get packed down in there and it's, you got to clean it out, which is kind of annoying. Also, the spare tire is located under the bed and is accessible in the trunk, which is great for packaging, but it's a problem if you have a bunch of stuff in the bed and you get a flat, which luckily has never happened to me, but it's definitely something to consider. As a side note, I also do keep my tie downs and ratchet straps in the trunk, and there have been times where I get a bunch of stuff in the bed and then I realize that I forgot to take the straps out of the trunk. So it's something you have to keep in mind. Overall, the trunk is still one of my favorite features. And finally, to wrap up my dislikes, a couple of ergonomic things. The cruise control button is located in sort of a weird spot that's kind of a reach. That's a little bit annoying. And the steering wheel, while it does tilt, it doesn't telescope, which for me is a little bit annoying. I can't quite get the driving position that I want perfectly. So those are all my thoughts on the Ridgeline after my ownership experience. I would say overall, I think the Ridgeline is a really, really awesome vehicle. I think it's really overlooked. It gets a bad rap. At the end of the day, it's got the capability that most people need without any extra, which means you get the best riding and handling truck you can. So while it makes some compromises compared to traditional body-on-frame trucks, when you look at towing and off-road capability, the Ridgeline really is an extremely well-rounded and practical vehicle. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.